So, well, the pattern of this evening actually is I'm going to be giving a talk, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end to go into pairs or groups and really to share, if you had a sense of something meaningful in what you heard about the Buddhist traditions that I was talking about, something that's touched your heart or your mind at all, it's the opportunity just to share it with somebody else, or you feel grateful that you have this in your life. Then after that we'll have a tea break, and then we'll have a period of the mindfulness of breathing. So we're continuing with the theme of the 6 emphases of the movement, of the Triratna movement, and the theme this evening is what Bhante describes, what Sangharakshita Bhante describes as being ecumenical. Well, that's how he describes it in the original talk that he gave. And actually I was there, it was on a convention, and I was there when he gave that talk. And it's always a privilege, actually, to know that you kind of had it firsthand, and it's in your being and in your personal history as well. So ecumenical, he defined as means that you don't identify exclusively with one tradition. So this is talking about what the movement does. And it's good to use some quotations from him. So we stay with the enormous wealth of the Buddhist tradition, which he also describes as a great treasury. And Bhante goes on to say that those ideas, principles and practices help us to develop as Buddhists in the contemporary Western world. Okay, so it's how they are helpful for us here, now, in current conditions. And he describes Western as secularized, industrial, I would add technological as well. So he's using it not for a part of the world so much as for a particular way of living, which is spreading, he said then, which was a good few years ago now, to all corners of the world. So this is about taking the traditional teachings of the Dharma and actually how can we make them the most meaningful within the current world situation, within how we are as beings in that situation as well, and maintaining the vision and the integrity and the Dharmic truth of what resides there. And well, also he talked about the world in terms of the spread of Triratna and the spread since the time of that talk. So actually this is a teaching which is available not only for people in the UK, but for many other countries, including France. These are countries where we have our centres or our groups: France, Poland, Turkey, Mexico, Venezuela, South Africa, India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other countries as well. Yeah. So it's significant in terms of time, and it's significant in terms of place. And Jai Maitreya has placed on that side of the shrine a picture of the refuge tree, which I'm not going to go into in a great deal of detail, but that holds the lineage of the traditions that we are still following and recreating as well, and in terms of the particular people who were the teachers, or in some cases the transcendental beings which are the teachers. So it holds the kind of history which I'm going to be talking about, and includes Bhante as well. And also Bhante's significance, I think, is that he has just written and spoken so much about all the traditions of the Dharma. I can't imagine that anybody else has done more than that. And if you haven't noticed the 25 volumes of his complete works in the library, I mean, just have a look. It's hard to believe how anybody could do that and live all kinds of an active life around that. So he has served it by recording it and discussing it. And he has this kind of vast overview, I think, of the Buddhist tradition. And then in quite a humble way described himself as a translator. think translators are very, very important in the spread of the truth, actually. But he was not translating from one language to another, but translating the significance and the meaning of those original practices and movements and so on. So communicating the Dharma and preserving it. And there are three main preceding traditions, which I'm going to say something about, which is the Hinayana, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. And I mean, I can't say a lot about all three this evening, so I want to just bring out what feels relevant for us, because we are the inheritors, and in a way we're also the preservers of those traditions. So I want to start with the Hinayana, which is translated as the lesser way. Lesser is probably a huge understatement, because this is the time of the Buddha. The Buddha having become enlightened in our world and deciding to teach. And it is a time when people are actually therefore intimately close to an enlightened being and having some sense of the radiance, really, of the enlightened teacher. So we're talking about the time when the Buddha was living and teaching. And what he did was very appropriate. He taught and he embodied the fundamental truths of the Dharma, and he taught with such sort of dedication. The Buddha walked miles and miles and miles in his life, and he introduced the teachings, he shared them, he repeated them to all kinds of people, all classes of people in the world that he was living in. Kings and queens, Brahmins who tried to challenge him, beggars and prostitutes. He communicated the Dharma to every human being, because every human being is worthy to hear it. And what he was doing was he was making sure he set out the really fundamental basic teachings. So he talked about the Four Noble Truths and conditionality. He talked about the Noble Eightfold Path, aspiring to what is perfect in our practice. He gave us the precepts. He taught meditation. He communicated mindfulness, metta, he taught the Brahma Viharas, and he was doing this right up to his deathbed. And there were also times when he withdrew. He went to the forest, he went to the wildness and the wilderness and beautiful spaces for contemplation. And I think, well, he encouraged the whole of our sort of human life and our inner life, and I think he encouraged the intelligence of the mind and also the orientation of the heart. So he communicated about devotion, about ardour, about faith. And I think we can only imagine what it was like to be with the Buddha. But when people met the Buddha, well, they're recorded as always saying the same thing, which wouldn't be exactly like that, but they would say wonderful, marvellous, the light has shone in the darkness, what was overturned has been made upright, and so on. So the impact of meeting him and the impact of being in his presence, or being a follower and continuing his presence, was very, very strong. We can only imagine that, I think, from not only the quality of what he communicated, but just in some way the radiance of his being. And this experience really is held by the oral tradition. It wasn't written down. It was just people with absolutely wonderful memory faculties. So it was the skill of the illiterate mind. And often it therefore came in that repetitive kind of way, the same words, the same phrases, which is not immediate realism always, but it holds the continuing profound truth of what was happening. And he had disciples who became enlightened, who went forth, who taught, and who followed his instruction, his encouragement to teach for the benefit of the many. And coming on to Bhante many centuries later, he lived in the spirit of the Theravadan tradition. Once he was in India, once he left the army at the end of the war, destroyed all his papers, all the sort of factual records of his identity, changed his name and became a wandering holy man. And he had a begging bowl for his food. So Bhante wasn't just the person who wrote the books, he was also somebody who lived out the tradition. He went forth. And later on in this process, because actually he was going to walk all the way from southern to northern India, but in part of this process he had his bhikkhu ordination. And he was so keen, and he had a companion with him as well, they were so keen to be ordained that he couldn't wait. And they walked across the disused railway track in the absolute height of the Indian summer, day after day, because they just wanted to get there. And then he became, as it were, a Theravadan bhikkhu at that stage of his life. Okay, so we'll now move on to the Mahayana. I talked about this quite a bit on Dharma Day, but it's a pleasure to be able to repeat it again. So the Mahayana is the Great Way, and it's very much about the arrival of the book, the arrival of the printed word, and actually the wonder of literacy. And this was happening in a changing world. The Buddha was no longer there. Things needed to be expressed in another way, often expressed through myth, through metaphor, through imagery, and through imaginative vision. And it was an expanded world, very different. Not only could many people read, but also it was a time of trade. It was the time of the Silk Route, which was a sort of network of trade across that part of Asia, including from India to China. So this kind of mixing of different nationalities and so on, and business transactions and everything was very, very different. Included China and Japan as well. And there was a time when a third of the world was Buddhist. And the Mahayana was therefore more expansive, more visionary. It included the laity much more. And it wasn't just about individual enlightenment. There was a strong, the Buddha's teaching wasn't just about individual enlightenment either as the main goal of your life, but in the Mahayana, the alternative became even more explicit, so that we would wish to be enlightened for the benefit of all beings. And that, of course, is the arising of the bodhicitta, and it's about the figure of the bodhisattva. So as the literal presence of the Buddha is gone, he's still there as a presence to be imagined, and the vision actually broadens out much more, and held by spiritual intensity. And so the Dharma was written down, it was being communicated in different countries, it was being translated into native languages, and actually in Tibet, the written alphabet was created initially so that the Dharma could be written down. Okay, not for your shopping list and for your notes to your friends, that were children's came as well. And again, when we're still on the Mahayana here, and again, the individual we have moved from the sense of individual enlightenment to the sense of shunyata, to the sense of what the ultimate state of existence is and could be for us. What we often call emptiness, that's one translation, is empty of fixity, it's empty of the unchanging, but it's also about the flow and connection and the playing out of all experience. And so there's a richness and a beauty there, and so on. And also therefore needs a loss of sort of inevitable involvement with our own selves as the most important reality for us. And so the written word continued to be very, very valuable, and Bhante was written so much about the Mahayana, and also when he was a very young man in London, he went into a bookshop and bought the Diamond Sutra. Interesting choice. He went in and bought the Diamond Sutra, read it, and knew that he was a Buddhist. So his connection with the Mahayana tradition actually was very early in his life. And the Mahayana, I think, is about scholarship and about the imagination. So it's teasing out the truths of the Dharma, taking them deeper. It was holding the sense of myth. So though one can give a lot of literal information about that time, they have their own myth of certainly how the perfection of wisdom came into existence. And this is that a young student, who would later be called Nagarjuna, went to the ocean, side of the ocean, I think, and a Naga princess came up holding a book from those beautiful waters. And the Nagas, of course, are the serpent dragons and mysterious beings. And the text that she brought was the perfection of wisdom in 30,000 words. So we've gone from no written words to 30,000 written words. And the ocean is the sort of vastness of this. It's a bit like Shunyata. And the Nagas, the Naga princes and kings, were the preservers of the Dharma, serpent dragons. This is the myth. Okay. So in some ways it's not literally true, but in another way, in terms of the imagination, it conveys a deep, profound truth beautifully. And then Nagarjuna went on to be a very significant Buddhist scholar and a figure on the refuge tree. And within the perfection of wisdom tradition, we have also the Heart Sutra, which we're very familiar with, the Diamond Sutra, which was Bhante's book, and so on. And within that period, in India, Nalanda, the great sort of Buddhist university, came into existence, huge university, of all these texts that were now being written down. The human mind and heart just so engaged with the Dharma there. And, the Muslims invaded and set Nalanda to fire, basically, and it took 3 months for all the books to burn. 3 months. But quite a lot was preserved through translators and through people, translators who also then carried their translations to other countries, particularly to China. So again, the preservers of the Dharma are so important. So scholarship, yes, certainly, and certainly at that university, but also the importance of the imagination. So there's a more visionary perspective, really, and a more poetic perspective. So, as I said before, the truth needed to be communicated by simile, metaphor, symbolism, myth, to reach out and up, actually, to the profundity of the experience, and to be less factual, more insubstantial, more mysterious, more aesthetic. And that's about beauty and wonder, and speaks to our sense of devotion. And we experienced some of that, really, when we looked at the White Lotus Sutra. in these evening sessions as well. Things like the Dharma like a rain cloud. And then that's an image, it's a simile, and then there's a whole piece of text that really explains and brings that to life and makes it beautiful. And the Heart Sutra was written on walls and stones by the wayside, and books were special. They were wrapped in gold cloth and placed on the shrine as objects of devotion. And we still, when you say these days, don't put a Dharma book on the floor, ideally. Don't worry if you have, but put it, that sort of reverence as well for the book because of the truth that it contains. And this is also the period in which Shantideva wrote the Bodhicharyavatara. So he wrote the words that we recite in the Sevenfold Puja. So something else really important emerging here. And the Sevenfold Puja is across the Eastern world where it's practiced and been practiced regularly for centuries. It's called the Anuttara Puja, the incomparable puja, the incomparable worship. And we can get very familiar with it. We can get very familiar with the word puja. Oh, are you going to the puja? But it's really good to be aware of its long-standing and international significance and the importance of what it says and what we have the privilege of saying. And later in the Mahayana, we also have the emergence of the archetypal Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Figures like Avalokiteshvara, Amitabha, Manjushri, Prajnaparamita, and so on, because the imagination was needed, the imagination was enabling us to envisage beautiful archetypal figures that communicate something of the nature of enlightenment. Elusive, coming and going, insubstantial, and so on, but also holding a kind of truth, a very deep kind of truth for us. So our imaginative lives actually are being expanded and filled out, and we have the access to that, and it's beautiful. Very beautiful. And this is what we call the Sambhogakaya. It's not the ultimate stage of the fully developed enlightened mind. That's shunyata, but these figures embodying the qualities of compassion and wisdom are deeply profound, deeply significant for us. Okay. So finally, moving on, the Vajrayana, the Diamond Way, what we often call Tibetan Buddhism, and the Dharma was taken from India to Tibet. So, Tibetan Buddhism functions in a particular country, the land of the snow, the land of highest mountains in the world, a land of very sort of intimate connection with nature and the energy of nature and possibly the spirits in nature. But the Vajrayana also continues very strongly the vision of the Mahayana. There's a flow between, not some sort of counter-culture. It's very important. So the same emphasis on the bodhicitta, the benefit of practicing for the enlightenment of all beings, the path of the bodhisattva, and the profound significance of compassion. And similarly, holding symbol, myth to express the truth, and actually probably almost even more imaginatively holding symbol and myth and beauty. It was about scholarship, very, very strong monastic tradition, and I think the largest monastery in Tibet was just over 9,000 monks living together. and also small gatherings of monks as well. It was completely open to the laity, and it became the culture of the country in Tibet in a way I'm not sure any other country in the world quite matched actually the way the Dharma formed the living culture of the country until it was invaded. There's an emphasis on immediate experience because enlightenment could happen now. It's accompanied by a lot of clear, quite strong teaching, particularly about impermanence. We need to get on with it really in our practice, the immediacy of what we have. And there was the arising of more Buddhas and Bodhisattva figures, of darkinis, at this level of the Sambodhakaya, again shimmering, insubstantial, translucent, coloured light, and they evoke the vision of enlightenment. And also the emergence of mantra, sacred sound. Maris talked about sacred sight, but mantra, chanted, aspiring to be transcendental sound, can be taken into the body and just be held almost with a kind of silence there. And also, as well as deep significance of mantra, ritual objects. So it was interesting that you were talking about the objects on the shrine actually at the very beginning, because the begging bowl, the bowls there, not the begging bowl, the bowls there are ritual objects. And we have many others, they have many others, and we've inherited them in some cases, so prayer flags, tankas, the offering bowls, and the Vajra. And the Vajra is, I'm going to put one on the shrine actually. If I was holding a Vajra in my hands, if you've never been here, if you just saw it, you'd think, oh, what's that bit of metal? But once we know what it means, which is energy, profound energy, and energy in pursuit of the good, balanced energy. Once we know that, and once we get familiar with it, thank you very much, and it becomes something else. And you can sort of almost feel it when you're holding it in your hand. So the objective world becomes different as our means of perception become more subtle and more aware and more informed, and all that supported by our ethical practice as well. So it's weighty, isn't it? This one is, I'll just place it on the shelf. And within that, within the Tibetan culture, is the figure of Padmasambhava. So Padmasambhava was a real man, and he also became a mythic, archetypal Bodhisattva, Buddha figure as well. But he had a personal history, and they say that the reason why he always looks the same when he's depicted is because it's based on what was probably a real drawing of him. And he did a lot to bring the more natural, the more other kinds of religion in Tibet, very much based on nature and the energy in nature. He did a lot to unite that with the Dharma, and that was really important, the Bon culture. And he also left his teachings, and we have those, and we have those texts and so on. And he left his teachings initially as terms for the future, so placed in some particular spot, particular building, where they would be discovered later. Okay. And he has his mantra, we chanted, and he's a strong figure in our practice, very significant figure in our practice. Like the Buddha, in a way, in his life. So, a human being and also an enlightened being. This is the very last bit here. So this is coming back to Bhante and his connection with the Vajrayana tradition. So in his progress of walking all the way up India, he was advised by one of his teachers to go to Kalimpong. And Kalimpong is where a lot of the Tibetan refugees from the invasion by China were actually escaping to. So there was a gathering of significant Tibetan teachers and lamas in Kalimpong. And those figures are on the lowest section with Bhante on the refuge tree. And his contact with them was deeply significant. For one thing, they gave him initiations into the meditation practices of some of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In fact, for Bhante, the first initiation was into the practice of green Tara, and he just did that practice for 12 years. And then later on, he was given another, I think, 11 practices, including Padmasambhava. And it's very important that he brought that back for us as well, because it gave him the understanding to be able to set up the sadhanas that we take when we're meditating. That's not an initiation, but it's an inheritance, a spiritual inheritance. And these Tibetan teachers were visionary, really, and we owe them a lot because they gave Bhante a vision of his future. And the most senior of them, Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, passed on to Bhante what he felt had been his responsibility, which was to maintain the unity of different traditions of Buddhism, or even different traditions within, say, the Tibetan Buddhism. So Jamyang had been very keen on always bringing these things together, keeping it together. So, and that was what he bequeathed to Bhante. Okay, and Bhante has done all the things that I've just described. And then Dado Rinpoche, somebody who quite a lot of people in the order visited actually in India, always felt a very significant link to him. And he asked or told Bhante to go back to the UK and to help to spread the Dharma in the West. Okay. So on that very good note, just